very good afternoon, our viewers. You're welcome to the Women's Show at Civic Space. And today we dive into the conversation of climate action and gender equality. Historically, climate scientists and researchers have revealed that there's been a disparity in diving into the conversation of how climate action and gender equality correlate. But we have also seen that the effects of climate action have posed a very big problem into achieving gender equality. And if we don't have the conversation right now, that means that we pose a very huge problem into achieving gender equality. With me, I have a panel of able women, and I'd let them introduce themselves, starting from the extreme left. Over to you.
Good afternoon. My name is Susan Achen. I work at Uganda Women's Network, where I'm the program coordinator for women's rights and access to justice.
You're very welcome to the conversation.
Thank you.
And we'll have our other panelists.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Nampijja. I work with Femmeforte as a catalyst, or you can call it program officer. I'm happy to be here.
You're very welcome to this conversation. And our very last panelist.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tricia Abwooli. I work with Akina Maama Wa Africa under the Economic Justice and Climate Action Program.
We are very, very excited to host the able panel of women who are doing work in the different organizations that address gender equality, but also ultimately address the conversation around climate action and gender equality intertwined. So to dive into the conversation, I will start with the lady from the Women's Network. Generally, what's your understanding, or why are we having the conversation of gender equality and climate action?
I think for us to have that discussion, we need to first of all look at what climate relies on. If I could call it, what are the resources directly related to climate? And that is where the discussion should start from. Women and men interact with resources, natural resources, differently, but women interact more with them because of their productive and reproductive functions in a society. What does that mean? We are the majority that form the labor force. In Uganda, the labor force in agriculture, for example, is at around 70%. Agriculture relies entirely on climate, on the weather, on the temperatures, on the fertility of the soils, which need enough water, etc. So the discussion around climate should start from there. And you know that historically women interact with any kind of resource, including the natural resources, normally through a male figurehead. Our ownership, our access, our usage of climate resources is directly hinged to a male figurehead. It's either your husband, it's a clan leader, it's your father, it's your brother. Even when you are a bona fide owner, when you are a legal owner, many a time because of our patriarchal nature, and expectations of society, that interaction is through a male figurehead. And that is where the inequality starts. Yes, that's where the inequality starts, because your ability to own, to access, to use is already curtailed, but also the whole discussion around climate change also affects women negatively, because these continue to be male-dominated spaces. Women are afflicted by limited information, limited access to these spaces, and that of its own is an inequality. But even when you look at the discussions going on around climate change, that is why we are here. The discussions do not factor in gender equality.
I think she highlights the fact that in as much as we are the global, our as the world, we are all affected by by climate change. But also it's not that we are affected in the same nature. So women are, at the end of the day, affected highly by the effects of the climate action. And as I want to drive to Mrs. Jackie from Femmeforte, can you highlight for us what are some of the impacts that we have repeatedly seen that the climate crisis imposes on the lives of women and girls in our communities?
Thank you very much, and thanks to our previous speaker for that wonderful insight. If you realize a person's vulnerability depends on the gender roles and relations, and women in rural areas are one of the most vulnerable groups when it comes to gender justice. Why do I say so? This is simply because they depend more on natural resources for their livelihood. Women in rural areas are engaging more in agriculture. And when we talk about climate justice and the impacts, we realize that a biggest percentage compared to the men, women are more affected. But also when I look at the urban area, to slightly move away from the rural setting, when I look at in the urban setting, you realize that women in the urban setting are equally affected by climate change. But when I apply the lens of intersectional feminism, you realize that the impacts are a little different, but somehow interlinked to each other.
Yeah.
What do I mean by this? When you look at a woman in the rural setting, if she is yielding less from her garden, it will somehow come back and affect the woman in the urban setting, that she's not able to purchase enough of what she needs for her daily income to sustain her family. Femmeforte will work so much with market women in our spaces, and constantly they've been sharing some of these impacts that they go through. Most of the women are female-headed, some of them are single mothers, but also some of the women who are in a relationship or married for say, they contribute a lot to their families. So in most cases, you realize that market women, if a woman in the rural setting is not yielding, the woman in the urban setting will equally not yield, though they are somehow different. Also, that applies to different categories of women, like women with disabilities, among others. And so when we look at the impacts of climate change, one of them that I want to address is on the changing seasons. And this means previously we were very keen and we noted the different seasons that we have when it comes to planting and all commercial farming, among others. But the changing seasons have highly contributed to domestic violence in our societies. How is this possible? You realize that most women, like I mentioned, the market women we're working with, they are contributing to their families. But because of poor planning or probably being less informed about the seasons, because they vary from year to year, you realize that they are not able to effectively contribute to their families like how they've been contributing. And one of the biggest contributors of domestic violence is poverty. So when there is that gap, this sprouts domestic violence in homes. So it is very important for us to address the issues of climate change and how they affect women. Another issue that I want to discuss is the impact of climate change limits women's access to services. And here I'll talk about education and healthcare. With healthcare, it contributes to increasing risks related to maternal child health. When we have heavy rainfall for a certain period of time, you realize that a woman is going to find it hard to go through the process of maternal and child health, starting from access to contraception, Then also the process of giving birth, the roads, you realize that in most rural areas, the health facilities are far. They are far away from their homes, and these women usually have to commute long distances to get to access services. So with slippery roads or bad roads, it will make it, a woman won't be able to easily access the services. And also after postnatal care, whereby this involves immunization, among others, of their children. In most hospitals, women are the ones who are there. They're the ones who take their kids for all these services. So climate change greatly affects women when it comes to that area. And then I'll talk about climate change and displacement.
Yeah.
This one mainly we are looking at women. When I'm looking at the urban setting, it is the women in slums, the slum communities, for example, in Kampala. So they are highly affected with this because they have to keep moving from one end to another. These slum communities are heavily packed, and also there's poor drainage. So when there are heavy rains, in most cases, their homes flood. And then as mothers, they have to take care of their children, and they lose property, but then they are forced to move to be able to save their families. And some of the areas like Bududa, we all know the landslides. So with all these issues are constantly affecting women and depriving them of their justice.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jackie, for highlighting some of the very, very worst impacts of the climate crisis on the lives of girls and women. And now as I move to Tricia, I know that Akina Mama is highly invested in the conversation of climate justice, and that they probably interact with different women in different categories on how they are able to get access to a couple of services. And also they're highly invested in the conversation on the global stage. I want you to just, and especially right now, we know that COP28 is happening, and Uganda is also having a representation on the global stage, but also as we dive into the conversation, maybe you could highlight for us some of the challenges that have constantly been imposed on access to climate justice.
Okay. So thank you. To begin answering the question you've posed, is for us to appreciate and look back to where we have come from so far. Is that historically, Africa was never part of this climate crisis. It did not begin this climate crisis. But it is to appreciate that the global north in general, with their industrialization that has come forward for over 2,000 years plus, began where we are right now. So in appreciating that, it is to acknowledge then also Africa, then what do we need to do as African women, or even as Africa in general, to combat the crisis? Because the conversation right now that is hovering is in terms of adaptation and mitigation. But so much little money is given to adaptation, which then Africa is entitled to contribute to in combating the climate crisis. But also we cannot speak about the climate crisis without, like Jackie said, in terms of the intersectionality of all other crises that exist in impeding women's rights. So the climate crisis just comes to exacerbate then the existing structures that are there, and that is the patriarchal system, the racism that is ongoing, the misogyny, the sexism, and all other isms that put women down in terms of embracing their full potential. So in acknowledging that is to say, okay, if this is what is affecting women, then why are we here today saying, having the topic of gender equality and climate crisis? But it is to acknowledge, just like the first speaker said, it is to acknowledge that, okay, women bear the brunt, the biggest responsibility of care work. And that is why then we come in to speak about the climate crisis and specifically linking it to women's rights and gender equality. Yeah. So for me, looking at the global and the regional conversations on the climate crisis and just how we have just concluded the Africa Climate Week and moving forward with all the declarations that were made then into, the COP28, and having not even addressed the existing debt that African countries bear in terms of combating this climate crisis. but rather that even the grants and the money given to us in adaptation is given to us in terms of loans.
Yeah.
But then we don't even look at who is really bearing the brunt of this crisis, but also in terms of paying back those loans. And that is where then tax justice meets the climate justice realm. So in terms of that, is that we are in COP negotiating, but even African countries, and to say the least that Uganda has delegated over 600 delegates to the COP,
That's
but
true.
the spaces to enter are not even available. So we cannot even enter these negotiation spaces. But also even among the 600, how many of those are women?
Yeah.
And what are they advancing? It is for us to really look at that. But also even among the, we know that, for example, France will have like 1,700 delegates for COP. And, you know, they'll sit together with the other European countries or the global north countries with China added to discuss how much then goes to Africa. Because then, for example, last COP 27, we had the conversation around the 100 billion the 100 billion donation to the, you know, to combat the climate finance architecture. But how much of that has been contributed to it? It was given in form of liberty that whoever has can contribute, rather than making it compulsory for the global north countries to contribute that much money into combating the climate crisis. It should not be optional, but it should rather be strict and should rather be a must for them to actually combat the climate crisis, because we are here in this space right now having a conversation about the climate crisis because of what they did for over 2,000 years plus.
Yeah.
But also it's also to look at the kind of grants that are given to Africa in general, and that is debt for nature swap. The solutions that they give us in swapping for the money that they give us also need to be interrogated. For example, you cannot have Germany and their parliament giving us money to combat the climate crisis, but the same is also contributing money to then carry on with the activities that deal with fossil fuel extraction. So that then poses a juxtaposition in terms of, okay, what are you truly combating or what are you truly addressing? You cannot give and then take
away.
with the same hand. If it is combating the climate crisis, then we all need to put our resources together in combating the climate crisis. But also, even when we talk about how do we combat the climate crisis in terms of the global inequalities between the global north and global south, it is to acknowledge that we cannot say that we are all equal in combating the crisis, because then that poses the issue of racism and the issue of it does not then put into consideration the issues of colonization that took place in Africa that actually then disadvantaged us from the start. But it is to say that the people that contribute most to the climate crisis need to actually contribute most to combating the climate crisis, rather than saying we should all contribute equally. But also the people with resources, who are mostly men, for example, in Africa, but also even in the global south itself, should be contributing more to combating the climate crisis than it is for women. And that's why we need to talk about issues of unpaid care work, for example, to bring that women actually contribute a lot to the global domestic produce. So why is their contribution never seen as contribution? And yet then we are the ones who rely solely and mostly on natural resources. So, but because of the decisions that are taken then by people that are in these spaces where women are never invited, then why are we then as women being called to then cater to be saying, okay, women should plant trees, take away some of your subsistent land and plant trees, which does not make sense, because then where is she going to plant her crops to feed, you know, the family and keep the family moving? Yeah, so for me.
I think Tricia gives a very big highlight in some of the forms of climate injustice that are globally being imposed on women, but also how it's very there's no inclusivity in trying to combat the crisis that has been contributed for by I think the entire globe. And as she finished, it's also a question was imprinted on my heart, and I'm like, if we have had conversations around I think in a year we have so many global conversations around the climate crisis. I know recently we had the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi. We have also seen the Africa Climate Week, and right now COP27 is happening, which is a global stage where all continents are represented in a conversation. And every year there's been commitments and there's been declarations. There's a lot of policies that have been put on ground, but now the question is, how far have we gone with the implementation? And that's why now maybe let's dive into the conversation of what is the implementation looking like. And I know even then our commitments like money, maybe giving money to different states or commitments like, oh, we are going to do this, and there's no follow-up. At the end of the year, the conversation is going to be resumed, and maybe the same kind of commitments are going to be made, and there is no implementation. Let me get back to you on the conversation of implementation, both globally and maybe nationally. How far are we going as our Africa or as the world generally? And we have a target to hit. I think we have 6 years away to the goal 2030. How far are we in that kind of conversation?
I feel it's important for us as a country to acknowledge that we are not giving enough attention to climate change. There is a huge perception in the public that climate change is a myth.
Yeah.
There are many schools of thought that it's a sham, it's an imported concept, and it is actually not something that should be paid attention to. And that is extremely unfortunate. And I think we also do not have a very clear picture of how climate change can actually affect us. For most of us, our knowledge of climate change is, the temperatures are rising, or the seasons are changing, it's not rained this year, We do not actually know, we do not see how climate change affects across the different development agenda. Jackie spoke about how it affects health, We are not necessarily looking at agriculture in terms of sustainability, in terms of food, We are not looking at the economic effects of climate change. And I think for us, that is where our conversation as a country should start. Because then it should give us a better understanding of not only why we should pay it very keen attention, but what exactly we should do for implementation. As a country, I think Tricia elaborated very well the situation on the global scene, which impedes our ability to adapt and mitigate, the inequality in negotiation, the inequality in financing, all the issues around colonialism and everything. It trickles down. Now, for us as a country, I think for starters, we are not even well prepared in terms of policy, in terms of what should we do. I am not very aware that we have a vibrant national adaptation plan. Right now, our ability for risk reduction, disaster risk reduction, seems to be up in the air. Let me give you this example. Every single year, we know it is going to rain, and we know it is going to flood, especially in highland places like in Bududa. We also see a lot of crisis in Kasese. But what happens every year? Wait for it to happen and then we react. I do not know that we have a proper weather, a proper climate weather forecasting system. Why don't we? These are things which a country should be able to track even for 3 or 5 years ahead. And there's technology to do that. I do not know that as a country we are placing resources for climate action deliberately in the places that it should go to. Right now, only 14% of the national budget is provided to climate action. But like I said, it links to different sectors. You cannot only speak about climate action without you looking at how is it intersecting with agriculture, how is it intersecting with health, because that is what is going to help us to implement. But I do not feel that we are ready even for implementation. And that is one thing that our leaders, our government leaders, those that make decisions, really need to take a very keen look at this. Sometimes I feel that we are in this whole conversation because it makes us look good.
On the global stage.
Yes, it makes us look good. I do not know what our national position was for COP28. Yes, I don't know what position we went into that discussion with, you know?
Yeah.
I know a few months ago there was a civil society convening to collect views on what we should give to government, on what our negotiators in that conference should present. Sometimes I don't feel that we are listened to.
As women or generally as
it is generally
civil society?
It is
actors?
generally, but now I'm coming to the question of women. You know, when we talk about climate change, it seems cliche for women, but it's a threat multiplier.
Yeah,
it's a huge threat multiplier. And having women in the room is one thing, but having them deliver what is actually going to connect the dots between climate change and gender injustice is a different story, because you'll find the conversations are dominated by men. And sometimes I ask myself, are we not challenging ourselves enough? You know? Yeah.
And I think that now imposes the fact, well, it's a fact that climate crisis and gender inequality are like intertwined together, are like the greatest, and I think, crisis we have now.
And that's sorry.
No, you can proceed.
Actually, I think one of the other big challenges on implementation is that we do not place women at the center of these discussions in terms of the design of interventions, in terms of even just looking at who is most marginalized. Right now, the discussions for me, I feel, are mostly capitalist in nature. Where is the money going? Who is controlling the money? You see?
Yeah.
What are the investment priorities of foreign powers? They do not place the most vulnerable to climate action at the center. And if we do not do that, then even whatever we are implementing is just going to scatter around the issue. Women will continue bearing the brunt of climate climate disaster. Yeah.
Which has highly affected. I think for every time there's maybe a climate breakout or like crisis in any region, whether we like it or not, you find that men can easily run away from such crisis. Like a man can choose to walk away, and the woman will suffer with probably all the children. Like Jackie highlighted earlier, if it's displacement, a woman cannot leave maybe her children or even all these other things that maybe that they've invested so much time in coming up with. So like I was trying to say earlier, that I think now with all the statistics and data that is showing from all the crises that we have had, it's a fact that when we talk about the climate crisis and gender inequality, gender inequality, together they like form the greatest crisis that this world has right now. And so I also know that differently in our organizations, we are doing different work, which I think, even if our policymakers are not fully invested in maybe advocating for the right policies or even tracking implementation and accountability, still back to our civil society organizations, we are doing different work. And I want to applaud women who are doing work around ensuring that women are supported even when such crises happen. and also work that is being done to even maybe not reaching the stage where we are just now mitigating or providing solutions for a problem that has already happened, like our government does when Bududa gets landslides. That's when the conversation of, hey, we need to find a place, we need to do this. That's when now they wake up. And when it doesn't happen, there is no thought of, hey, what can we do as a country? And right now we know, as Tricia highlighted, and I think I saw it around, that we have 600 young people and 600 advocates represented at the COP27. How many do we have as women? That's something that maybe we may not even get the statistics, right? But also, we know that there are negotiations going on. What kind of conversations, or what kind of, what voice is being put out there to represent Uganda in particular? Well, I just want to now get to our civil society organization. Jackie, I know that I've personally been in part of the programs of Femmeforte, and I know the work they do around empowering women. But also, I know that, like you highlighted, you work with different women who are at the end of the day have been directly affected by the effects of the climate crisis. Maybe would you mind highlighting to us some of the work that you've done to directly support them, and what voices do you get? What conversations women have? What do they have to say about this whole conversation?
Thank you. I want to start with this quote. Allow me read it. It's a bit long. It was by one of the feminist human rights defenders, and it says, she's called Macha Fonin. It says that if you're invisible in everyday life, your needs will not be thought of, let alone addressed in a crisis situation. And I think this is exactly what we're talking about right now. So with Femmeforte, like I mentioned earlier, we've not done much around climate justice, but the few people we've been working with, the market women, like I mentioned, I think I've already shared about that, the discussions we've been having with them, but maybe allow me to talk about what would be some of the recommendations, what would be some of the way forward when we are discussing climate justice. One key thing to note is in many cases, women are underrepresented in decision-making processes when we are discussing climate change. And I think that if we are looking at gender equality and equity, we need to do a lot of mindset change around that, because there's no way we are going to have discussions around climate justice when there's no inclusivity. We need voices of women being heard. We need to hear the voices of women. We need to let women speak up. We, as civil society organizations, we need to do a lot of work around mindset change, but also creating awareness, because like my colleague mentioned, we are talking about climate change, but what is the depth of climate change? How do people understand it? How do women understand? How do women interpret it? Is it only about the changes in seasons, or does it affect other different sectors? So it's very important for us to be able, as civil society organizations, as feminist organizations, to empower women, to create awareness so they understand. I believe that when we do this, we shall be able to have women representing in the budget processes. For example, the budget cycle, my colleague mentioned of the 14% that is allocated to climate action in the national budget. So I feel like it is at 14% because as we're talking about climate justice for women, the women themselves are not understanding what this is. So the more we support them, we'll realize that there will be an increase. That could be one of the stepping stones. There would be an increase in budget. They will engage more in the budget processes and budget consultations, but also they would be able to attend different advocacy platforms, and they're able to speak out. Another thing we're doing as Femmeforte is on gender responsive budgeting.
Yeah.
This is mainly looking at gender equitable distribution of resources. It's important, especially maybe it's something that key stakeholders can apply when it comes to planning for disaster preparedness, because we realize that climate change affects more women than men. So it's very important for us to have gender responsive budgeting when we are planning. And maybe lastly on that, it's also important for us as feminist organizations, women rights organizations, to apply a feminist perspective during planning processes of climate justice projects. Yeah, like as we are starting the initial process of writing the proposals and all, it's very important for us to apply the feminist perspective when we are doing projects around climate justice or related to climate justice.
Thank you so very much, Jackie. And now I'll get to the last question for Tricia. Like you highlighted earlier, I think Akina Mama is doing a lot of work in like regards to advancing the conversation. I just want maybe if you could highlight for us what does it look like in terms of achieving what in the feminist conversation. How are we achieving, and what recommendations have been coming through from all the work that you guys do, and what could be that we would want to hear, or women who are watching, or other policy actors who are watching, what conversations would they dive into to help us achieve equality in our interventions?
Okay. I'll begin with what Jackie has just talked about in terms of gender responsive budgeting, but also to know that, okay, even in everything that we do, and like Jackie said, even in our projects, even in our work, the writings that we do, the research, is to know that all these crises and all these inequalities, or all these isms are not separate from each other, but it is to constantly bring them together and actually highlight them in a more, in a more together sense of it, because the climate crisis is not any different from the economic crisis that is happening currently. And it's also not any different from the health crisis that we have, the agriculture crisis, the security crisis. But it's to say that all these crises are one, and we need to look at them, not to separate them highly. But also in looking at them, we need to know the people that are differently disabled by the different crises. And to acknowledge that is to say, okay, if women are heavily impacted in the climate crisis, then we need to make laws that then speak to that in order to combat the crisis. But for me, it's to also highlight that, for example, our own budget, even if it's 14%, most of our budget is funded by the global north, not even just by our taxes. So what does that speak to us? It is to say, then we are having dictatorial terms on what we should spend on, how we should spend on it, and who gets what percentage and how much do they get. But it's also to task government to say, okay, if we are getting this money, first and foremost, it's not supposed to be a loan. These are reparations that are owed to us by the global north. So if we are getting this money, we need to separate it in terms of addressing Africa's lived realities. Because our lived realities are not the same as what the woman in USA or the woman in China goes through. What the woman in Africa or in Uganda specifically goes through, more so for urban and the rural, what they go through are different experiences. Though they all lead to one experience, but they are quite different. So it is to acknowledge that and say, okay, if we are getting this budget, if we are getting this money, we need to be able to negotiate enough to say this is money owed to us, not to come as a debt. Because the more it comes as a debt, then the more we are able to be swayed in what we then advance. For example, the case of Congo itself and what Congo is going through. Because of the money that they keep getting in terms of loan and grants that then the global north gives to Congo, then the global north is constantly then extracting the resources that Congo has, which is the same case for Uganda alone. But then even in this extraction, then we realize that then women are bearing the biggest brunt of the repercussions of whatever is going on. Because like you mentioned, in terms of floods, it's not even just that the women cannot run because of children. It's just that we don't even have the resources to afford to run. Because if I run, then where do I go?
Yeah.
Even the IDP camps that then exist do not also favor women, because they are the biggest sources of domestic violence against women. The rape, the defilement that goes on in there without even the government addressing some of these things. But also it is to say that as we are going through this crisis, and I just want to re-emphasize this further, it is to keep writing and calling out the Global North on all the things that they are doing. For example, we have the ongoing conversation in the feminist realm on climate justice is to say, okay, now we need the fund on loss and damage. And who is contributing to this fund? How are we contributing to it? Let it not be optional. Let it be compulsory for the people that have actually brought about the crisis. Because, for example, if China contributes 23% of the global gas emissions, we cannot be contributing the same as Africa, which contributes less than 3% of the global gas emissions. But we cannot say then all of us as the world, let us all come and contribute to this crisis. Is to call out the people that actually contribute more to this crisis to actually bear the biggest brunt of combating this crisis. Because, for example, when we receive funds, for example, and I think I'll speak to like the most recent false solution, which is what we have termed it in the climate justice advocacy realm, is to say, for example, money given and then we are told to make carbon markets for that. Or we are told then to say plant trees, but what kind of trees are we planting? There are palm trees, there are eucalyptus trees. What is the impact of these trees on the soil? Because the moment you plant, for example, a eucalyptus tree, then the soil is dried up. You cannot plant anything else. You cannot plant a banana for your own subsistence consumption.
Yeah.
You cannot plant beans together with the eucalyptus. It dries the soil and it takes 5 more years for that soil to actually come back to what it used to be. But we are constantly told, okay, plant trees, a tree a day. And the trees that, you know, the government keeps giving us is eucalyptus and the palm tree oil, whose dire effect to the soil is actually much more than what we would get out of it. Because then these trees are carbon absorbers. So the ideology is that if the global north keeps emitting and Africa has planted enough trees, then we shall absorb the carbon. But that doesn't take away what is happening, is that we shall do everything as Africa, we shall adapt, we shall mitigate, we shall do everything to combat the crisis. But if the perpetrators themselves are not even willing to take initiatives to combat the crisis, then we are doing nothing. So for me, it is to say, if we are going to combat the climate crisis as it is now, then people that are actually exhibiting the crisis need to do their part of the work to stop this crisis in the first place. Because we as Africans, or even as women, even if I put out a part of my land just to plant 1 tree or 2 trees that then absorb carbon dioxide, if the factory that is contributing the global gas emission is still functioning on fossil fuels, I'm doing 0 to do that. Floods will still come and hit me. The temperatures will keep on rising. The rain is still going to disappear. So it is to say, okay, the people that are actually heavily invested in the fossil fuel industry, in the climate, in the industrialization industry that has existed for over 200 years and above, is for them to be held accountable in the first place to combat this crisis. But even in their combating of this crisis, we cannot then separate ourselves from all the other injustices that have happened, because all these contribute on how gender equality is achieved. And last time there was a joke around the SDG, you know, the goal 30 that you mentioned earlier, and the joke, you know how their theme is leave no one behind. And the joke was, in global north terms, that then just speaks to leave them behind in terms of Africa, really, because we are in 2024, ideally, because, well, we are in December, but, and that means we are left with only 6 years to achieve these goals. But where are we? What have we even achieved? there is nothing. We are just actually adding on each other crises over and over again and just keep adding and achieving really nothing. So who are we joking with? Is it us that are then now just seen as the recipients of the consumers as usual? Of, okay, we have these trees, they have been modified in a lab. Who is the very first person to, buy? And then very first we are looking at Africa, and indeed African women. And because we rely really solely on natural resources, because then even what we tell women in the rural areas or urban areas in Africa is very dependent on us who have information. It is to say that no, you do not owe anyone to take aside your land for planting subsistent food for you to actually combat the climate crisis. It is to say that yes, this crisis exists, then who do we hold accountable? From the nation is to say we need policies in place that then speak to this crisis. And we need you to be held accountable for how you contribute to this crisis. Because, for example, it was funny how last year, Kasese with the flooding, and the only money that was in the budget for disaster preparedness was just 1.3 million. Like, then what does that then speak to us? But also, it also, like I said earlier, it also then speaks to how much power do our governments have in negotiation places. And if we keep pushing our governments to have power, then what kind of people are we taking into this space to actually fight for our rights? For example, right now, our sisters, Kenya, actually having they got a fund from the World Bank on combating the climate crisis, trickling down to actually the county levels, which then for Uganda would be the district local governments. But then this grant, it is termed as a grant, but it's really not a grant. In the end of it is that they are giving and taking something from us. So it's also us to look into the kind of grants that we get in combating the climate crisis, because we do not want them to give us grants and tell us to do things that then just exacerbate the climate crisis. To be given a grant and told to plant eucalyptus, that is not actually combating the climate crisis. So for me, it is in our advocacy work to keep calling out what solutions actually speak to Africa's lived realities, to the African woman's lived reality, both in the urban and the people in the rural, but also Africa in general. What are our lived realities in terms of this crisis, and what is our role in combating this crisis, and who needs to actually bear the biggest brunt in terms of combating this crisis? For me, that is very crucial.
Thank you so much, Tricia. And I wanted to impose a question of how do we support solutions by women? But then I realized that most of the solutions that women, especially in the rural kind of areas, are also guided by the little information that they have about the crisis. And their solutions are still minimum to just like the basic conversations of, hey, let me cut a piece of my land and plant trees, which are going to pose a very huge impact on how you're going to be able to get food in the next 5 years. And we have also seen that right now we have a food crisis. Food is very expensive, and I recently I was speaking to my mom and she was telling me we don't even have matoke, we don't even have like the bare minimum. And we know that Uganda is one of those countries that really we cannot lack food. But this is where we are now. And I know it's the same story. If you go in the market right now, if you used to use 60,000 to shop for a week, right now you're probably using double that or even more. So thank you very much, ladies, for the very, very exclusive conversation on the climate crisis and gender inequality. And I know some of the recommendations that have been drawn from this conversation will guide our viewers out there on what to do and what we are doing. Is it really contributing to combating or even to ending or to calling out? If we're not calling out, can we start doing that right now so that maybe, and we're not saying that as a single person calling out will be enough, collectively. And I hope that we wake up to the reality, especially not adapting to the lived reality of women or people in other continents, to think that maybe we're not doing enough and yet we are not even contributing like half of what they are. So I'll get back to you ladies to maybe give your parting shots and also maybe a last recommendation that you want to give either to government or to our women out there or generally policy makers. Over to you.
Mine would be, my parting shot would be around, as a country, adopting an ecofeminist approach to this climate justice discussion.
Yeah.
Ecofeminism believes that gender equality, climate change, and social injustice are intricately linked. And if we do that, then we have the final victim in sight.
Yeah.
And when we do that, then we can plan properly. The other would be, for me, that our government needs to critically take adaptation seriously. We can no longer talk about mitigation. I think we passed that stage long ago. But what are our adaptation priorities? We need to identify those as a country, identify those as a country, and then work towards having an enabling legal and policy framework for adaptation, one that is multi-sectoral, so that we are looking at adaptation across the development agendas, but also focusing very keenly on building resilience of the country, of individuals, of communities, so that when crisis hits, they are not left very destitute. Resilience can be built in health, it can be built for agriculture, it can be built for economic empowerment, it can be built also through basic risk reduction. Yeah, that would be mine.
Thank you so very much. Over to you, Jackie. I know we are being warned, time is up, but yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. My recommendation, I would stick to the civil society organizations, feminist organizations, because some of the stakeholders are trying to do something around climate justice and climate change, but I feel like it's very important for the people we serve, the women we serve, to understand what climate justice means for them in relation to other different sectors. So we still have a lot of work to do and a lot of unlearning to do, but also it's very important that we consider unpacking climate justice in detail for the women that we are working with.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And now over to you, Tricia.
I think for me, my parting shot is as women, but also us with information, the civil society organizations with information, is to constantly unpack what power is. But this is not just even power on global, regional, or national, even just in our own homesteads, what power looks like for women, which will be better placed for us to actually then begin attempting the question of gender equality. Because for most of our households, we don't even know who actually owns the power, because we think this is a norm that we should just constantly go by. But if we acknowledge what are those invisible powers, what are those visible powers, and what are those hidden powers, then we can begin to actually unpack some of these crises and inequalities that exist and hinder women's potential. So for example, in the household, it is to know who actually bears power in some of these households. Yeah. Is it the man? Is it the woman? Is it the family? Is it the culture that we exist in? Is it the national that we exist in? And for us, it is to also know that also even some of our stakeholders do actually are people, and they do not even understand what power means to them. Yeah. But also, even for us as a country, who is actually behind the power of the country? Is it really the president? Is it really the laws that we are putting in place? Is it really the money that we are getting and the conditions that come with it? For example, just last, I think it was September, when the president made a ban against the second-hand clothes and the threats that came with that, even just trickling down to threaten people on terrorism attacks that didn't even exist. Is to, okay, say, when we make some of these pushbacks and make some of these pushbacks boldly, how then that's when we start to unpack power, because that's when the actual power really comes in. Because even just banning second-hand clothes shouldn't come with so much threats from the US in terms of how much money we then receive the next year or what they are funding the next year. Because we know, for example, we get a lot of grants from US in terms of HIV prevention, which really trickles down to how many women actually have access to that drug. But it's to unpack the powers of power and say, okay, even us as women, after unpacking that power analysis, to say, okay, even us as women, how much power do we have within, or just with power with as women, and how much can we do with that? That if we can then form something just together as women, then what does that then look like for us? And what are the issues that we can then unpack for just having that power with all of us together? But also even just the national is to say, okay, how do we then advance or unpack the power structure at the national level, even just at the district level, from the LC1 to the LC5 to the, the defense, are they called the residence defense units at the government levels, for us to actually unpack what is really causing the gender inequality that exists and the patriarchal systems that exist. And the power analysis is really just a blanket umbrella for what feminist analysis and feminist approaches in things looks like. Yeah, for me, that is really just.
Thank you so much, our viewers, for sticking with us until this time. And I'm very glad that the conversation has been held. Let's draw recommendations in our different sectors and also in our different capacities, and see what can be done. What can you do as an individual or your initiative or in your work? And as we dive into the conversation, or as we dive into our action, let's ensure that we are advocating for the right cause, and we are ensuring that we are working for women and for girls out there. It's been me, Prisca, and I'm glad to host this show today. Over to you. Thank you very much.